The woman in gray silk didn't bother lowering her voice. A contract bride. And Devon's leftovers of all things. What is Severo thinking? I was sitting at my own wedding reception in the most beautiful dress I had ever worn, and I heard every single word. I reached for my water glass. My hand was perfectly steady. I had learned steady inside Devon Vitali's marriage. 3 years of being made invisible had taught me how to hold myself so still that the things aimed at me sometimes missed. Sometimes. The groom's chair beside me was empty. The man I had contracted myself to, Severo Adriano, whose third name I had only discovered 40 minutes ago when a staff member's lapel badge confirmed what the stone crest above the iron entrance door had already told me, had not yet appeared. 400 guests filled this hall. His family. His associates. His world. And every single one of them had already rendered their verdict before I opened my mouth. Devon's reject. A plus-size black woman with the audacity to sit at a Vitali altar on a 1-year contract as if that made her one of them. And Devon himself, my ex-husband, the man I had divorced 8 months ago, the man whose family estate I had apparently just walked back into wearing ivory silk, was standing near the bar doing what he had always done best. Working the room. Distributing ammunition. Rewriting history for anyone willing to listen. I heard his version traveling toward me in fragments across the hall. She wasn't built for this world. Some women aren't meant for a life like this. I wish them well. I just hope she read the contract carefully. The room absorbed every word like gospel. Heads nodded. Eyes slid toward me in a way. A man near the end of the table straightened his cuffs and looked at the wall. The particular gesture of someone who has made a decision and doesn't want to be seen making it. I had been fluent in this language my entire life. The language of rooms that had already decided. The language of people who use their indoor voices to do their loudest damage. I set down my water glass. I did not give them the reaction they were building toward. I had given this family enough of my reactions. Enough of my tears. Enough of my silence and my shrinking and my desperate, exhausting effort to become small enough to be accepted by people who had never intended to accept me. Not today. What none of them knew, what I couldn't have told them even if I wanted to, was that I had signed that contract 6 weeks ago under a name the intermediaries had deliberately kept incomplete. Severo Adriano. Clean. Private. Untraceable back to the world I had spent 2 years escaping. I had needed the relocation fund. I had needed the distance. I had needed 12 months of solid ground beneath my feet after 3 years of a marriage that was really just a very elegant, very quiet form of slow disappearance. What I had not known, what I was only now beginning to understand as I sat at my own wedding reception being systematically dismantled by people who had loved Devon's version of me before they ever laid eyes on the real one, was that Severo Adriano had a third name. And the man who carried it had loved me since I was 7 years old. If you can feel what's coming, you're right. Stay with me. Because what happens when those doors open is going to change everything. Subscribe right now so you don't miss a single second of what this ruthless man does next. I was still holding myself steady, still counting the cost of composure, still calculating whether the exit clause in my contract could be invoked before the evening destroyed what remained of my dignity, when the quality of the room changed. It wasn't a sound. It was a pressure shift. A collective held breath moving through 400 people simultaneously like a current cutting every conversation clean in half. I looked up. The doors at the far end of the hall had opened. And the man walking through them, unhurried, dark-suited, completely still in the way that only truly dangerous men can be still, was not scanning the room the way people scan rooms when they are looking for someone. He already knew exactly where I was. He had known before he pushed those doors open. He walked through 400 people like they were furniture he had long ago memorized, and his eyes, dark, direct, completely focused, were fixed on my face like I was the only coordinates in the building that mattered. I knew those eyes. I had known those eyes since I was 7 years old, kneeling in a garden with venom on my lips and his hand gripping mine and his voice, steady even then, telling me I was the bravest person he had ever met. My breath left my body. Severo. Not a stranger. He had never once been a stranger. And as he crossed the hall toward me, as I saw the scar on his left hand, small and pale, the one I had put there with my thumbnail during the worst 30 seconds of my childhood while I was trying to save his life, I understood with the full force of 25 years landing at once that nothing about this day had been an accident. Not the contract. Not the name. Not the intermediaries. Not the terms. Not any of it. Devin saw him coming. I watched the color leave my ex-husband's face in real time. Not the pale of surprise but the pale of a man who has just understood the full architecture of something he thought he controlled. The woman in gray silk stopped mid-sentence. The man who had straightened his cuffs looked up from the wall. The room that had spent the last hour building a verdict around me, went absolutely, completely, permanently silent. Severo reached my chair. He stopped. And when he looked down at me there was nothing in his expression that the rest of that room would ever be permitted to see. Something old and certain and completely unashamed, the look of a man who had been waiting 25 years for exactly this moment and found it worth every single day of the wait. He extended his hand. And I understood, in the space of one breath, with the contract dissolving to irrelevance somewhere in my bag and 25 years of questions finally resolving into a single answer, that I had not come here for a transaction. I had come home. I took his hand. And everything that happened next, every reckoning, every revelation, every person in that hall who had laughed at the wrong woman began. I needed 30 seconds to confirm what I already suspected. The staff member closest to me was a tall man in a dark jacket moving efficiently between the entrance hall and the corridor beyond. I stepped directly into his path. He stopped. His lapel badge read Vitali Estate Senior Staff in small gold lettering and I stared at it for exactly 1 second before I looked up at his face. This is the Vitali Estate. It wasn't a question. He heard it as one anyway. Yes ma'am. Mr. Severo Adriano Vitali's primary residence. He said it the way people say things that are so obvious to them they cannot imagine why they are being asked. Is there something I can help you with? I released him with a small smile and a thank you he didn't deserve and stood very still in the middle of the entrance hall while the world reorganized itself around 4 words. Severo. Adriano. Vitali. I had signed a contract. I had read every document the intermediaries provided. I had searched Severo Adriano across every database available to me and returned nothing alarming. A private man, a wealthy one, someone careful enough about his public profile to keep it deliberately sparse. I had found nothing alarming because there was nothing to find. He had removed it. Deliberately. Surgically. Every trace of the third name scrubbed clean from everything connected to the arrangement. Because he had known. Whoever he was, whatever he wanted, he had known that if I had seen the name Vitali on that contract I would have returned it and signed and put an ocean between myself and this world before the ink dried. He had been right. I stood in that entrance hall and let the full weight of it settle into my body the way bad news always settles. Not all at once but in stages, each stage worse than the one before. The Vitali world. The world I had spent 3 years trying to belong to and 2 years trying to survive having left. The world that had a specific language for women like me. A language of pauses and redirected glances and smiles that arrived half a second too slow, communicating volumes while maintaining perfect deniability. I had been fluent in that language since the first dinner I attended as Devin's wife, when his mother looked at me across a table set with more silverware than I had owned in my entire childhood and said how lovely in a tone that meant precisely the opposite. 3 years. I had given 3 years of my life to a marriage that was cold from the beginning and only got colder. Devin had never loved me. I had understood that within the first year. What had taken longer, what had cost me more than I could accurately calculate, was accepting that he had never intended to. That the marriage had been, from his first calculated move toward me, about something that had nothing to do with me at all. He had wanted something his brother had valued. He had taken it. And then he had lived inside the taking of it with the bored impatience of a man who had gotten what he reached for and discovered it wasn't what he wanted. 3 years of that. 3 years of a husband who slept in separate rooms and looked through me at dinner and brought other women's perfume home on his collar with the casual indifference of someone who had stopped pretending so long ago he had forgotten there was ever anything to pretend. 3 years of reaching for intimacy and finding only cold air. Of being made to feel that my body, my warmth, my need for genuine human connection were inconveniences he was generously tolerating. He had tried twice to take from me what he had never bothered to earn. Rough and entitled and utterly devoid of tenderness, and both times I had held myself so still, made myself so unreachable, that he had eventually stopped. I had survived those nights by going somewhere deep inside myself where his hands couldn't follow. A place I had been protecting without knowing I was protecting it. A place that had always, somehow, belonged to someone else. I had walked away from that marriage with 2 suitcases, a divorce settlement that barely covered 3 months of living expenses, and the knowledge that I was 32 years old and had never once in my life been chosen by someone who understood what choosing meant. And now I was standing in the entrance hall of the family estate that had produced the man who had used me as a chess piece, wearing an ivory gown, holding a contract with his family name on it. Devin materialized at my elbow before I could take my next full breath. I smelled his cologne first. The same one, unchanged, the kind of sensory detail that bypasses every defense the rational mind constructs and lands directly in the body. 3 years of that smell. 3 years of associating it with the particular tension of a shared space that never became a shared life. His voice arrived next, warm and careful and precisely calibrated to the register he had always used when he needed something from me. Ellis. What a surprise. I turned to look at him. He was exactly as I remembered. Handsome in the architectural way of men who have always known they were handsome, dressed in something dark and expensive, holding his champagne glass with the easy authority of a man standing inside his own inheritance. He looked good. He always looked good. It had taken me an embarrassingly long time to understand that looking good and being good were not the same category of thing. Is it? I said. Something moved behind his eyes. A small recalibration. He had prepared for several versions of this encounter, and the version where I didn't flinch, didn't look for the nearest exit, didn't immediately begin the process of making myself smaller to accommodate his comfort. That version had not been high on his list. His smile settled into something slower. More deliberate. The smile of a man who has just picked up something sharp and is deciding how to use it. Of all the arrangements Severo could have made. He tilted his head. I have to say, I never expected this one. He leaned just close enough for the next part to feel like a confidence and land like a blade. Did you know who he was when you signed? I held his gaze and said nothing. His smile widened. He had his answer. I watched him turn back toward the gathered guests with the comfortable authority of a man returning to his natural habitat, and I stood in the entrance hall in ivory silk and white peonies and thought about everything that had led me here. The divorce papers signed on a Tuesday morning in a lawyer's office that smelled of old paper and finality. The 2 suitcases. The intermediary's card pressed into my hand at a networking event by a woman I barely knew who said only, "Someone is looking for a woman of integrity." The terms are generous. Think about it. I had thought about it for 6 days. I had signed on the 7th. I had needed the money. I had needed the distance. I had needed to believe just once that a door I walked through was leading somewhere instead of simply away from somewhere else. I smoothed the front of my gown, lifted my chin, found my seat, and when a woman I had never met looked up from the reception table and took a long, slow inventory of me from neckline to hem, I met her eyes and held them steady and unblinking, until she was the one who looked away. I had not come here to disappear. I had done enough of that. Devin worked quickly. I had forgotten how efficient he was at this. The quiet social demolition, the careful art of poisoning water before anyone reached for a glass. He moved through the gathered guests with the ease of a man in his family home, dropping words like stones into still pools and watching the ripples move outward with the satisfied expression of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and enjoyed it. I caught fragments from my seat at the reception table. That was always how it worked. Fragments, never the full sentence, always just enough to understand and never enough to directly address. My ex-wife, if you can believe it. Severo always did things his own way. I wish them well, of course. I just hope she understood the terms she was agreeing to. The laughter that followed was polite. Confused at first, the laughter of people receiving information they hadn't requested. Then, as the pieces assembled themselves, something warmer and less charitable replaced it. I felt the room temperature shift the way you feel weather changing before the sky announces it. A drop in pressure, a collective subtle reorientation, the particular quality of air that precedes a verdict being reached. I found my seat at the reception table. The chair beside mine was empty. The groom's chair. I set my small bag on the table and straightened my napkin and looked out at the hall with the composed expression of a woman who was absolutely fine and would continue to be absolutely fine regardless of what the next several hours required of her. The woman across the table caught my eye and smiled with her mouth only. The smile of someone who has just been told something interesting about you and is in the process of filing it. I reached for my water glass. Took a slow sip. Let my eyes move across the room with what I hoped communicated calm. And then without choosing to, without warning, without the courtesy of a gradual transition, I was 7 years old and the garden was chaos. Every adult within 20 feet was screaming for someone to do something and nobody was doing anything, and Severo was on the ground with his ankles swelling purple and his face going the particular gray of someone whose body was losing a war it hadn't agreed to fight. I could still see it with a precision that 25 years had not softened. The afternoon light, the specific smell of that garden, the sound of adult panic, which is so much more terrifying than childhood panic because adults are supposed to know what to do. I pushed through them the way only a child can push through adults. Beneath their notice, through the gaps, propelled by something that hadn't learned yet what fear was supposed to stop you from doing. I dropped to my knees beside him. He looked at me. Even then, even with venom moving through his blood and his body beginning to lose the argument, he looked at me with those eyes. Dark, direct, completely focused. The eyes of someone who had decided to anchor themselves to something real while everything else became uncertain, and had chosen me as the anchor. I did the only thing I knew to do. When it was over, when the adults had reorganized their panic into action and the worst of it had passed, his hand found mine. I remembered the weight of it with a completeness that bypassed memory and lived in the body instead, the way first things always do. The certainty of it. The way he held on like he had made a decision about me in those 30 seconds and didn't intend to revise it. "You're not scared of anything," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. Everything in him was rough at the edges. But his hand was steady. "I'm scared of everything," I told him. The truth. I had always been honest with Severo in ways I couldn't explain even to myself. As if his particular quality of attention made dishonesty impossible, made the usual social lubricants of small untruths feel unnecessary and beside the point. He shook his head slowly. "Then you're the bravest person I know." I had not understood then what he meant. Bravery had always seemed to me like the absence of fear. Something other people had, something I was perpetually in the process of acquiring. It had taken me 25 years to understand that he had seen something truer than that. That bravery was not the absence of fear but the decision to act in spite of it. And that 7-year-old Alice Morgan, shaking and terrified, dropping to her knees in a garden because someone needed her to, had been doing exactly that. I came back to the present to find the woman across the table still watching me with her filing cabinet smile. A server appeared at my elbow and refilled my water glass and disappeared again. Somewhere to my left I could hear Devon's voice rising slightly, the particular register of a man who had found an audience worth performing for. The groom's chair was still empty. I thought about what Devon's marriage had actually been. The 3 years of separate rooms and deliberate coldness and the particular humiliation of being in a marriage where your husband looked through you at dinner like you were a piece of furniture he had grown tired of but hadn't gotten around to removing. I thought about the nights he had reached for me, not with tenderness, never with tenderness, but with the blunt entitlement of a man who believed ownership and love were the same category of thing. The way I had gone somewhere deep inside myself on those nights. The way I had held my body so still, made myself so unreachable in every way that mattered, that eventually he had given up and turned away and I had lain in the dark afterward understanding with my whole body that I was intact in a way that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the part of me that had always known, without words, without logic, with the deep wordless knowing of something fundamental, that I was keeping something for someone. I had not known then who that someone was. I was beginning to understand now. The groom's chair was empty. The room was building a verdict around me. Outside these walls somewhere, a man who had held my hand in a garden 25 years ago was preparing to walk through those doors. I picked up my water glass and held it steady and waited. The first course arrived and Devon sat down. Not at a different table. Not at a respectful distance that acknowledged the history between us and the basic human decency that history required. 3 seats to my left, close enough that his voice reached me without effort. Close enough that every word he aimed at the table was simultaneously aimed at me with the precision of a man who had spent 3 years learning exactly where my nerves were and had never lost the map. The food in front of me was beautiful. Delicate and expensive and arranged with the kind of artistry that announces money without mentioning it. I had no appetite whatsoever. Devon began the way he always began, with warmth. The expensive kind, indistinguishable from genuine warmth to anyone who hadn't spent enough time on the receiving end of both to know the difference. He addressed the table with the practiced ease of a man who had always known a room was listening and had always considered that his natural right. He talked about the unconventional nature of certain arrangements. About how practical people made practical decisions. About how a one-year contract was really quite sensible for certain kinds of women. Women who understood their own situation clearly, who weren't perhaps ready for something requiring more. He looked at me when he said certain kinds. The table absorbed it. A woman in green silk nodded with the thoughtful expression of someone receiving useful information. A man near the far end straightened his cuffs and redirected his attention to his plate. The specific gesture of someone who had made a decision and preferred not to be seen making it. I set down my fork. The contract was my choice, I said. My voice came out clear and unhurried and level, and I was grateful for every hard-won piece of that. Grateful for the discipline that 3 years of Vitali dinners had given me, even as it had cost me other things. I had learned, in that marriage, how to sound composed when composure was the last thing I felt. I had learned it the way you learn things in difficult circumstances. Not by choosing to, but by surviving the repeated necessity of it. I find that women who know exactly what they want tend to negotiate better terms. The table went still in a different way. Devon's smile stayed in place. But something shifted behind his eyes. The second recalibration of the evening, a small adjustment of aim. He had prepared for deflection. For the polite, pained expression of a woman who wanted to be anywhere else. For the version of me that had spent 3 years making herself invisible at his family's tables. He had not prepared for a complete sentence. Of course, he said smoothly, pivoting without missing a beat. He had always been good at pivots. It was one of the things I had once mistaken for intelligence. Ellis has always been very resourceful. He said it the way you say a word when you mean its opposite and need the table to understand the translation without your providing it explicitly. It's something I always admired. A few people smiled. Someone asked him a question about something else. The conversation moved, and I was left inside the specific silence of a woman who has spoken clearly, been heard, and been dismissed in the same breath. I knew this silence the way I knew my own reflection. Its exact texture and weight, and the precise cost of sitting inside it with your spine straight and your hands still. I thought about the contract. 1 year. The name Severo Adriano on clean heavy paper. The intermediary who had handed me the proposal across a coffee table in a neutral office with the careful neutrality of someone who understood they were facilitating something larger than they were permitted to explain. I had asked questions. I had received professionally vague answers. I had done my research and found a man who had scrubbed himself from every searchable record. Not the absence of someone with nothing to hide, but the very deliberate absence of someone who understood that privacy was its own form of power. I had signed because I was tired. Because 2 suitcases and a divorce settlement that barely covered 3 months felt like the entire sum of what 3 years of my life had produced. Because 12 months of financial stability felt at that point like the most romantic thing anyone had offered me in years. What I had not known, what I could not have known, was that the man who had arranged it had been watching me for 20 years. That the generosity of the terms was not calculated charity, but the specific patient generosity of a man who knew exactly what he was asking someone to give up and had decided the compensation should be worthy of it. Devon's voice rose slightly across the table. Another performance beat, another blade wrapped in silk. Not everyone is built for permanence. Some people need transitional arrangements. There's no shame in knowing your limitations. He looked at me. I thought about a boy in a garden holding my hand. I thought about 3 years of separate rooms and cold silences and the particular violence of being made to feel like a burden by someone who had chosen you for their own reasons and was now charging you for the privilege of his disappointment. I thought about the nights Devon had come to my room, not in love, never in love, but in the entitled darkness of a man who believed proximity to a body granted him rights to it. The way I had gone somewhere inside myself on those nights. Somewhere no one could follow. Somewhere I had been keeping safe since I was old enough to understand that some things, once given, cannot be retrieved. I had held that place inviolate through 3 years of marriage with a man who had never once earned entry to it. I had not understood then why I was so certain. Sitting at this table in this hall, with the groom's chair empty beside me and Devon's voice still distributing its careful damage, I was beginning to understand. I know exactly what I'm built for, I said quietly. Not to Devon. Not to the table. To myself mostly. To the part of me that needed to hear it said out loud in a room full of people who had already decided otherwise. Devon heard it. He looked at me for a long moment with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not cruelty, not satisfaction, not the comfortable authority of a man in his element. Something more complicated. Something that might, in a different man in a different life, have been the beginning of understanding. Then someone refilled his wine glass and he turned away. And I sat in the silence he left behind and held myself together with both hands and waited. Emboldened by Devon's performance, the room found its voice. It happened the way these things always happened. Gradually at first, then with the momentum of a crowd that has identified a safe direction and commits to it. First Devon alone, working the room with surgical precision. Then the table following his lead. Then the wider hall. The associates and cousins and long-standing Vitali loyalists who had spent decades understanding which way the wind blew inside these walls and adjusting accordingly. A woman who introduced herself as a Vitali cousin settled into the chair 2 places from mine with the comfortable authority of someone who had never been questioned at this table in her life. Older. Pearls. The specific cultivated elegance of old money. Not the flashiness of new wealth but the quieter, more dangerous confidence of people who had never needed to announce themselves because the rooms always already knew. She asked sweetly whether I had fully prepared myself for what carrying the Vitali name would require. Whether I understood the expectations. Whether my background had given me what she called, delicately with a small tilting smile, adequate foundation for a world like this. She held my gaze while she asked it and kept the genuine concern stitched so perfectly across her face that anyone watching from a distance would have seen only a woman helpfully welcoming a newcomer. I knew what it was. I had been receiving this particular species of cruelty since the first time I had sat at a Vitali table 3 years ago as Devon's new wife and his mother had looked at me with the same smile. Wide, warm, immaculately hostile. I appreciate the thought, I said. She patted my hand. Turned to the woman beside her and said something too low for me to catch. Whatever it was made the woman glance at me briefly with the expression of someone confirming what they had already suspected. An associate's wife asked about my family with the wide innocent eyes of a woman collecting evidence for a case she was quietly building. A man at the far end of the table said, "Contract bride," in a voice calibrated to travel. Not shouted, not whispered, but pitched at precisely the volume that ensures it arrives without making the speaker accountable for the landing. The phrase moved through the room like smoke, touching everything, leaving a residue. And underneath all of it, underneath every polished question and redirected glance and smile that arrived half a second too slow, the other thing. The thing that had followed me into every room I had ever entered that considered itself important. The thing nobody said directly because the language of polite society had evolved sophisticated mechanisms for communicating it without the vulgarity of actual words. My body. My presence. The specific unapologetic fullness of me in an ivory gown at a Vitali altar. The curves that Devon had once called substantial in a tone that communicated clearly he considered this a problem to be managed. The roundness that a Vitali family friend had once described as lush in a very ethnic way, with a smile that was meant to be a compliment and landed as a taxonomy. I had lived inside this specific form of assessment my entire life. I knew its rhythms. I knew the way a room's eyes moved over you and arrived at a conclusion before you had opened your mouth. I knew the particular exhaustion of being in a body that other people felt entitled to have opinions about. Loud opinions, quiet ones, the opinions disguised as concern and the ones disguised as compliments and the ones too honest to bother disguising at all. I had spent 3 years inside Devon's world trying to shrink. Not physically, you cannot will your body into a different shape no matter how much a marriage makes you feel you should. But in every other way. Quieter. More careful. More grateful for the space I was being allowed to occupy. I had spent 3 years performing a version of myself designed to take up less, ask less, need less. I was done performing. I reached for my water glass. My hand was steady. Whatever this evening cost me I would pay the bill without letting them see it. And then, without choosing to, without warning, I was 16 years old and it was the last summer before everything changed. Severo was standing at the edge of his family's garden in the early morning dark, and I had found him there the way I always found him in those years. By instinct, by the particular pull of a friendship that had never needed to announce itself. His bag was at his feet. The Naval Academy uniform was pressed with the severe precision of someone who had stood at an ironing board the night before with something to prove and no one to prove it to. I had known for months it was coming. The acceptance letter. The departure date. The particular pride in his father's expression that lived alongside the grief in his mother's. I had known and I had not known how to hold it. This thing that was good for him and devastating for me and required me to perform happiness I felt only in the abstract. I couldn't say goodbye. The word wouldn't construct itself in my mouth. We stood in the gray morning light and I felt everything I had never said filling up the space between us with a weight that made it hard to breathe. He had always known when I couldn't speak. He had always been willing to wait. He turned and looked at me for a long quiet moment. His face in that light was the face I knew better than any other face in the world. The angles of it, the particular stillness of it, the way his eyes always said more than his words because he was careful with words in a way he had never needed to be careful with me. "I'll come back for you, Ellis." I had laughed. It was the only available container for everything I couldn't say. "You don't have to say things like that." He didn't smile. Severo had never used smiles as punctuation. When he smiled it meant something specific and irreplaceable. Right now his face was simply certain. The way his face had been certain at 7 years old with venom in his blood. The certainty of someone who had made a decision and was stating it as a fact that the universe was going to have to accommodate. "I know I don't have to." He picked up his bag. The light was changing, the gray going gold at the edges, morning beginning to announce itself. "That's exactly why I mean it." I had laughed again because I was 16 and terrified of believing in something I couldn't hold on to. Because believing him felt like standing on the edge of something enormous and I didn't have the vocabulary yet for what enormous things required of you. I came back to the reception hall. The woman with the pearls was watching me with patient expectation. She was still waiting for the reaction that hadn't come, the flinch or the tears or the graceless discomfort she had been promised by Devon's earlier performance. I looked at her steadily. I thought about a boy who had picked up his bag in early morning light and said I'll come back and meant it with every cell of himself. I thought about how I had laughed. I thought about how he hadn't. The groom's chair had been empty for 2 hours. I had stopped looking at it with expectation around the 90-minute mark. Now I was simply aware of it the way you are aware of a missing tooth. Not constantly, not obsessively, but with the persistent low-level consciousness of an absence that the mind keeps returning to despite the futility of returning. The reception moved around me. Conversations arced and settled. Glasses refilled. The hall had the particular hum of gathered wealth in a social situation. The sound of people who had spent their entire lives in rooms like this one and moved through them with the unconscious ease of water finding its level. Devon held court near the bar. From where I sat I could see the group around him. 6, 7 people shifting and refreshing as some departed and others arrived. The natural gravity of a man in his element drawing the room's energy toward him like a current. He had not looked directly at me in over 40 minutes. He didn't need to. The work was done. The room knew what it thought of Elise Morgan in her ivory gown at the Vitali altar, and Devon had given it permission to think it openly. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and I thought about what I was actually doing here. Not the surface answer, the contract, the money, the fresh start. Those were real. But underneath them, in the honest place I had been excavating carefully over the 2 years since the divorce, I had been asking myself a more uncomfortable question. Why had I agreed so easily? Why had I read a contract proposal from a stranger and felt not suspicion but something quieter and stranger? Something that felt embarrassingly like recognition. Like a door I had been standing in front of for a very long time and had finally been handed the right key. I had told myself it was pragmatism. I had told myself it was exhaustion. I had told myself that a woman who had survived Devon Vitali's marriage was entitled to a transaction that at least had honest terms. I had not told myself that some part of me had felt, reading those documents, like something was coming back. The thought was too large to hold in a room full of people who had already decided I was ridiculous. I folded it away. I reached for my water glass and held it and thought instead about the exit clause and the 6-month minimum and the 90 days notice and whether any of that was going to matter given that I appeared to have stumbled back into the exact world I had spent 2 years and most of my savings escaping. Devon's laughter carried across the hall. Rich and easy and completely at home. I thought about the nights in his marriage. The locked door of myself that I had held closed with everything I had. Not because I was afraid precisely but because I was certain. Certain in the deepest, most wordless part of me that what Devon wanted from my body had nothing to do with what my body was for. That giving him that would be the one loss I could not survive intact. I had been careful with that certainty the way you are careful with something irreplaceable, protective of it, private about it, unwilling to examine it too closely in case examining it disturbed the foundation of it. He had tried. Twice. come to my room in the dark with the blunt entitlement of a man who had confused legal access with invitation. Both times I had gone somewhere inside myself so completely, so far down to a place so still and unreachable, that eventually he had turned away. He had called me cold afterward. He had called me other things. I had absorbed those words and filed them in the category of things people say when they cannot get what they want and need to make the refusal your fault rather than their failure. I had held myself inviolate through 3 years of that marriage with a certainty I could not explain. I was beginning, sitting in that hall with the groom's chair empty beside me, to understand the explanation. And then the quality of the room changed. It wasn't a sound. It was something beneath sound. A pressure shift, the collective caught breath of 400 people doing something simultaneously without coordinating it. Conversations stopped mid-syllable. A glass paused halfway to a mouth. Even the staff, the efficient, invisible staff who had been moving through the room all evening with the professional seamlessness of people very well trained and very well paid, went momentarily still. I looked up from my folded hands. The doors at the far end of the hall had opened. The man walking through them moved differently from everyone else in the building. Not faster. Not with more force. Simply differently. With the particular quality of someone who had never once in their life needed to calibrate their entrance for anyone else's comfort. He moved like someone who had long ago stopped performing and was simply present. Completely, entirely, overwhelmingly present in a way that made everyone around him seem slightly less solid by comparison. Dark suit. No tie. Dark hair with silver at the temples that spoke not of age but of something weathered and refined by experience into something more formidable than youth. A jaw set with the particular tension of someone managing something enormous and keeping it entirely internal. He was not scanning the room. His eyes were already fixed on my face. Not moving toward me. Already there, already landed, already seeing me with a focused precision that cut through 400 people and the length of the hall and every intervening thing as if they were made of air. Something happened in my chest. Something old. Something that lived below memory, below the rational organizing mind, in the bedrock layer of the self where the most fundamental things are kept. Something that knew, before I had processed the face, the walk, the precise dark focus of those eyes. Something that had been waiting 25 years for this exact moment. Oh, it said, in the voice that things say when they are not words but feelings too large for language. There you are. He crossed the room like he had already memorized it. Not glancing left or right. Not navigating. Moving with the absolute certainty of someone for whom navigation is unnecessary because they have already accounted for every variable. He moved through 400 people and the room parted for him not because he asked it to but because some things simply happen. The natural order of elements finding their correct position without being instructed. He reached my chair and stopped. I looked at his face and the recognition didn't arrive the way I expected recognition to arrive. I had thought, in the half-second between seeing him and knowing him, that it would be intellectual. A matching of memory to present. A filing of features against stored images. Instead it arrived in my body first, below thought, the way cold water arrives when you step into it. Total, immediate, impossible to be partially inside of. I knew those eyes. I had known those eyes since I was 7 years old and they had looked at me from a garden floor with venom in the blood and something in them that said, "You are real, you are the most real thing in this moment, whatever happens I am choosing to look at you." Severo. The name assembled itself in my mind with the force of something that had been trying to be said for 25 years. Not a stranger. He had never once been a stranger. My first friend, the one who had appeared in my childhood with the specific gravity of someone who was going to matter, who had always mattered, who had been mattering continuously across the years and distance and terrible choices that had accumulated between us. My first love. The one I had laughed off at 16 because I was afraid of what believing it would require of me. The man standing before me was not the boy I remembered. He was what that boy had become after 25 years of building and serving and waiting and watching and making himself into something formidable enough to stand in front of me now with the calm certainty of a man who had earned every moment of this. He was more. He was so much more than what I had been carrying. He was not using a cane. He was not being guided. He had walked through 400 people and every piece of furniture in this hall and he was standing before me with his eyes focused on my face with the complete, unwavering attention of a man who could see every detail of it. My throat closed. He could see. He had always been able to see. Everything I thought I knew about his life. The venom, the damage, The years of what the Vitali family had carefully and consistently described as his condition, restructured itself in real time. The dark glasses in the photographs I had occasionally, against my better judgment, looked up in the years between his departure and my marriage. The careful positioning of staff at public events. The way Devon had sometimes referenced his older brother with that particular mixture of pity and dismissal that I now understood as something else entirely. The resentment of a man who has spent years feeling safe because he believed his brother diminished and is only now understanding he was never safe at all. Severo had seen everything. He had seen Devon pursue me while Severo was abroad. He had seen the wedding. He had seen 3 years of a marriage that was cold from its first day. He had seen me in the dark of those nights, holding myself inviolate against the blunt entitlement of a man who had never earned what he was reaching for. He had seen 2 years of rebuilding after, the careful, private, one foot in front of the other rebuilding of a woman refusing to be defined by what she had survived. He had watched all of it with clear eyes. And he had waited. I looked down at his left hand. The scar was there. Small and pale and 25 years old. A thin crescent on the side of his palm just below the thumb. The kind of mark that fades but never fully disappears, the kind of mark that carries its story in its shape. I had put it there myself, gripping him too hard during the 30 seconds in that garden when I was trying to keep him in this world and wasn't paying attention to what my hands were doing to his. I had apologized for weeks. He had laughed every single time, the real laugh, the rare one, the one that changed his whole face. It's my favorite scar. Don't you dare be sorry. My vision blurred slightly. I blinked it clear. How long? The words came out barely above sound. 2 words that contained everything. Every year. Every distance. Every decision he had made about how to love someone who didn't know they were being loved. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. Always, he said. 1 word. Delivered without drama, without qualification, with the simple directness of a man stating a fact he had lived inside for so long it required no elaboration. 25 years in 1 word. My breath left my body and I let it go and I sat inside the resulting stillness and felt, beneath the shock, beneath the grief for all the years of not knowing, beneath the slow detonating understanding of everything that single word rearranged, something else. Something enormous and quiet and warm. I had not been invisible. Not for a single day. Not for a single moment. I had been seen, carefully, consistently, across every year and every distance and every circumstance, by the most focused pair of eyes I had ever looked into. Somewhere to my left I heard Devon's voice stop. Not trail off, stop. The sudden silence of a man whose words have left him entirely. I heard the sound of a glass being set down too quickly, the small percussive announcement of hands that have stopped cooperating with composure. I did not look at Devon. I could not have looked away from Severo's face if the building had shifted on its foundations. He extended his hand. Open palm. The scar visible. The gesture of a man who had been patient enough to wait 25 years and was now simply waiting 1 moment more. For her, only ever for her, with the specific patience of someone who had always understood that the only version of this worth having was the one she chose freely. I looked at his hand for a long moment. I thought about the contract folded in my bag. 1 year. Clean exit. Severo Adriano at the top in clean black type. The most careful arrangement anyone had ever built for me. Careful not because it was elaborate but because it had understood, with devastating precision, exactly what I needed to feel safe enough to say yes. A door. He had built me a door instead of a cage. And I had walked through it. I placed my hand in his. His fingers closed around mine with the quiet permanence of something that had always been true finally being acknowledged out loud. His thumb moved to the center of my palm. Not to the scar, he was too careful for that, but close. The old gesture. The childhood gesture. The one that said I see you in the language we had been building since we were 7 years old and hadn't needed words for it. The room understood it had made an error. The specific, permanent, unrecoverable kind. Severo turned to face the room and said nothing. He didn't need words. He simply turned, unhurried, completely present. And the full accumulated weight of who he was landed on every person in that hall simultaneously. Not the performance of authority but the real thing, the kind that doesn't require announcement because the room already knows it and is simply waiting to be reminded. I watched the recalibration happen in real time. The woman with the pearls went very still. The associate's wife looked at the table. The man who had said contract bride in a voice calibrated for travel suddenly appeared to be studying something extremely interesting in the middle distance. Devon was motionless near the bar, both hands at his sides. His face, the face I had spent 3 years reading across dinner tables and silent hallways, was doing something I had never once seen it do. It was afraid. Not of consequences, not of social embarrassment. Of recognition. The specific fear of a man who is finally understanding the full size of what he stole and what that theft has actually cost him. Severo extended his hand to me. I stood. I had not planned to speak. That was the truth. I had come to this reception intending to survive it with whatever composure I could hold together. To get through the evening without giving the room the reaction it had been engineering toward since I arrived. I had survived Vitali events before by staying quiet, staying still, presenting the minimum surface area for damage to find purchase on. But I was standing beside Severo Vitali with his hand in mine and 25 years of understanding detonating slowly through my body like light through a window after a very long darkness. I was standing in the truth of what had actually happened, not the version Devon had been distributing all evening but the real version, the one that had been true all along beneath every lie and every silence and every year I had spent believing I was alone in it. And something in my chest simply stopped apologizing. I looked at Devon first. He deserved the first word. He had spent the last 2 hours earning it. You told me I wasn't built for this world. My voice came out clear, unhurried. The voice of a woman who had run out of reasons to sand down her edges for the comfort of people who had never once softened anything for hers. You said it across a dinner table 3 years ago when I told you I wanted more presence in our life, more honesty, more of whatever it was you were protecting by keeping everything at such a careful distance from me. The room was absolutely silent. You said it the way people say things they fully believe, matter-of-factly, almost kindly, like you were doing me the service of saving me from aspirations I couldn't sustain. I looked at him steadily. You were right. The beginning of something moved across his face. Relief, satisfaction, the reflex of victory. I wasn't built for your version of it. The reflex died. I turned to the woman with the pearls. The associate's wife. The man who had straightened his cuffs. The cousin who had asked about my background with her wide charitable eyes. I looked at all of them in turn, without hurry, without performance, with the specific quality of attention you give things you are done being intimidated by. I signed a 1-year contract, I said. I came to this estate 6 hours ago carrying 2 suitcases and a very practical understanding of what I was agreeing to. I came for 12 months of financial stability. For the distance I needed to rebuild a life that had been quietly, systematically dismantled inside a marriage that was never what it presented itself as. My voice held. I was grateful for that. I checked everything I was permitted to check. I made a reasonable decision based on available information. And then I walked through those doors and found my ex-husband drinking champagne in my groom's family home. A few people shifted. I sat at this table for 2 hours while he reminded you all very efficiently of everything he had decided I was. I listened to that language. The careful language, the polished language, the language that communicates everything while remaining technically courteous, and I recognized every word of it. I paused. I have been hearing that language my entire life. In every room that decided before I sat down what kind of woman I was. What kind of body I had. What kind of story I deserved. The hall was holding its breath. I looked at Severo. I didn't know I was coming home, I said. I signed a contract for 1 year and I showed up expecting a transaction and instead I found, my voice caught just slightly the first crack in the composure of the entire evening, and I let it be there because some things deserve to crack open in front of witnesses. I found the person who has been seeing me clearly since we were 7 years old. Who built me a door instead of a cage. Who understood that the only version of this worth having was the one I chose for myself. Severo's hand tightened around mine. Not possessively. Supportively. The difference between those two things was everything and he had always known it. His thumb pressed gently to the center of my palm. The old gesture. Private and permanent and completely visible to every person in that hall who was watching, none of whom had any idea what it meant, all of whom could see plainly that it meant something unrepeatable. I didn't come here to prove anything to this room, I said finally. I came here because 25 years ago a boy pulled me back from the edge of something terrible and I pulled him back from something worse. And we have been finding our way back to each other across everything that has happened since. I looked at the room. At all of it. The elegance, the judgment, the 2 hours of careful, polished cruelty that had been directed at me by people who thought they were operating at no cost to themselves. Whatever you think of that, whatever verdict you arrived at tonight, I want you to know that it was the wrong verdict. And I want you to know that I know that. And I want you to know that I am done conducting myself as though your assessment of my worth has any bearing on my actual worth. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had preceded it all evening. Those had been the silence of a room withholding judgment while it collected evidence. This was the silence of a room that had delivered its judgment and watched it returned unopened. Devon looked at the floor. The woman with the pearls looked at her hands. Severo looked at me the way a man looks at something he has been waiting a very long time to be allowed to look at fully, with the complete, unguarded, unmanaged expression of someone who has stopped being careful about what his face reveals because the person in front of him already knows everything worth knowing. I felt it land in my chest and stay there. Warm. Permanent. The room emptied the way rooms empty after something seismic. Not all at once but in the particular rhythm of people who need distance before they can process what they witnessed. Conversations ended with unusual efficiency. Goodbyes were brief. Within 40 minutes the hall had shed most of its population and what remained felt less like a party and more like an aftermath. The specific quiet of space that has held something large and is still vibrating with it. Devon didn't leave. I had expected him to. It would have been the rational choice. The graceful exit. The strategic retreat of a man who understood that a field lost is a field to be abandoned and reconsidered, not lingered in. Devon had always had that intelligence. The social intelligence of someone who knew when to regroup. Tonight he stayed. He was standing near the tall window at the far end of the hall when Severo crossed to him. I stayed where I was. Not because I wasn't allowed to be present but because this particular reckoning had its own geometry and I understood instinctively that it needed space to be what it was without me managing it. The two brothers faced each other in the diminished light of the emptying hall and the silence between them was the densest silence I had ever been adjacent to. It was not the silence of men who had nothing to say. It was the silence of men who had everything to say and had been not saying it for 20 years and were now, finally, inevitably, arriving at the moment where the account came due. Devon looked older than he had at the beginning of the evening. The performance had cost him. Without the audience, without the champagne glass and the easy authority of a man in his element, he was something rawer and more honest. He looked like what he actually was. A man in his mid-30s standing in front of the consequences of a choice he had made at 17 and had been living inside ever since. You knew. Severo's voice was quiet. The quietest I had heard it. Somehow that made it more final than volume would have. The moment she walked through the entrance today, you knew I had arranged it. You knew whose estate this was. You understood what her being here meant. Devon's jaw worked. Something moved in his face. The attempt at a defense, at reframing, at the kind of managed response that had always served him in difficult conversations. Then it dissolved. He didn't have it tonight. You should have told me, he said instead. You should have said. What? The word was gentle. That was the devastating thing. Severo's gentleness with his brother was not softness. It was the gentleness of someone who had already grieved this completely and was now simply speaking from the far side of that grief. That I told you at 17 that she mattered to me? That I said the actual words, that she was not available, that she was not someone you were going to pursue while I was gone. And you heard them and you smiled and you waited for my car to reach the end of the drive. Devon looked at the floor. A muscle moved in his jaw. She needed someone. The words came out quietly. Defensively. The weakest construction I had ever heard attempted. You were gone. You were going to be gone for years. She was. She needed me. Severo said it simply. Without anger, which was somehow much worse than anger would have been. She has needed me since she was 7 years old and I have needed her and both of those things were true when I left and they remained true while you spent 3 years treating her like a piece of furniture you had acquired in a competitive moment and no longer wanted to move. Devon flinched. You didn't love her, Severo continued. You married her because I had valued her and you wanted the thing your older brother valued. And then you kept her in that marriage not because you cared about her but because releasing her was the kind of admission you weren't ready to make. His voice stayed even. Controlled. The control of a man who had rehearsed this moment across many years and had decided long ago to conduct it without the self-indulgence of rage. You never touched her. The silence that fell was absolute. Devon looked up. I know, Severo said. Still quiet. I know what those years were. I know what you attempted and what she refused you, and I know why she refused you, and I know what it cost her to protect that refusal every single day inside a marriage that gave her nothing to hold on to. His eyes didn't leave his brother's face. I know all of it. Something broke open in Devon's expression. Not remorse exactly, but its precondition. The specific pain of being fully seen by someone who has every right to condemn you and is choosing something more difficult instead. I thought, he started. Stopped. Started again. When you left, I told myself she would be better with someone present. Someone available. Someone who wasn't going to be gone for years at a time serving. You told yourself a story, Severo said. You told yourself a story that made you the protagonist and me the absence and her the woman who needed what you had to offer. And you believed it because you needed to. He paused. But you knew. You have always known, Devon. You knew the morning I left. You knew at the wedding. You knew every day of that marriage. You knew when you finally gave her the divorce. Not because you had found generosity, but because you could not stand being in the same rooms as your own knowledge of what you had done. Devon said nothing. I stayed where I was across the hall watching the two brothers in the window light, and I felt something happening inside me that I hadn't anticipated. Not triumph. Not the satisfaction I had imagined in weaker moments over the past 2 years, that confronting the reality of that marriage would bring. Something quieter. Closer to release. The feeling of a door that has been held closed for a long time finally being allowed to swing open. Not into something new, not yet, but into air. Clean air. The simple relief of a space that had been pressurized finally decompressing. I had not needed Devon to love me. I had needed him to stop pretending, to himself and to me and to the rooms full of people he had filled with his version of our story, that his failure to love me was my failure to be lovable. Severo was doing that work right now. Quietly. Without performance. With the precision of a man who had been carrying this particular reckoning for 20 years and was delivering it with the care it deserved. I made a mistake. Devon's voice was quiet. Almost inaudible. You made a choice, Severo said. You made it with full knowledge of what you were choosing and what it would cost. That's not a mistake. A mistake is something done in ignorance. He looked at his brother for a long, still moment, not with hatred, which would have been easier for both of them, but with something more complicated and more permanent. The specific grief of a man who had loved his brother and been betrayed by him and had spent 20 years deciding how to hold both of those true things simultaneously without letting either of them destroy the other. I'm not going to carry this anymore, he said finally. I'm not going to hold space for it in my life or in our family. It ends here. Pause. You're my brother. You will always be my brother. But what you did to her, what you took from her, what you cost her, that does not get to live in the same house as us as if it didn't happen. Devon looked at me across the room. His eyes were wet. I looked back at him without cruelty and without comfort, with the clear, undecorated regard of a woman who has finally been given back the accurate version of her own story and doesn't need anything else from the man who took it. Go home, Devon, Severo said. Gently. Finally. Like a door being closed. Not slammed but eased shut with a click that was nonetheless permanent. Devon straightened. He looked at his brother one more time, a look that contained the entire history of them, 20 years of it, compressed into a few seconds. Then he walked toward the exit without looking back. I watched him go and felt, beneath the complexity of everything the evening had been, something in my chest loosen. A knot I had been so accustomed to that I had stopped noticing it, releasing slowly the way long-held things release. Not all at once. In stages. The way healing actually happens, not dramatically but in the quiet accumulation of moments when you realize the thing that was hurting has stopped. Severo came back to me. He stood beside me and we watched the last of the evening settle around us. The staff moving through the hall, the candles burning lower, the white peonies continuing their slow release of petals onto the tables. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The silence between us was nothing like the silence that had preceded it. This was old and warm and completely familiar. The silence of two people who had learned each other's rhythms before they had the language to describe them and had never entirely forgotten the lesson. Are you all right? He asked. I considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I will be, I said. Ask me again tomorrow. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. The beginning of the real smile. The rare one, the one that changed his whole face. Tomorrow, he said. And the day after. The estate was quiet in the way that old buildings are quiet. Not emptily but fully, with the particular density of walls that have absorbed centuries of living and hold it the way stone holds warmth. The guests were gone. The staff moved through the hall in the background with the efficient, considerate discretion of people who understood that what had happened tonight required space. Candles had burned to different lengths. The white peonies were releasing their petals in the slow, unhurried way of things that have finished being decorative and are simply being. The hall that had contained 400 people and all of their careful cruelties 2 hours ago was now just a room, large and old and quiet, holding what remained the way rooms hold things that matter. I stood on the terrace in my wedding gown. I had retrieved the contract from my bag an hour earlier and had been holding it since without reading it. Not because I didn't know what it said. I had memorized what it said. I had read it 30 times in the 6 weeks between signing it and arriving at the estate. I had held it tonight because I needed to understand what it meant now, what it had meant from the beginning before I knew, when I had believed I was making a practical decision about a stranger's proposal and had felt beneath the practicality something that I hadn't let myself name. The night air was cool on my bare shoulders. Below the terrace the estate grounds extended into the dark, old and tended and somehow restful, the kind of land that has been loved by the same family long enough to carry the memory of it in its soil. Severo came to stand beside me. He didn't announce himself. He didn't ask permission. He simply came and stood in the way he had always stood beside me, close enough for his presence to be felt, far enough for the space between us to remain entirely mine to cross or keep. We were quiet together for a long moment. The stars were out. The night was clear and cold and enormous overhead, and the estate grounds below us were dark and still, and the world felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a place I was allowed to take up space in. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "You can ask me anything." No hesitation. No conditions. The simplest and most complete thing a person can say. I turned the contract in my hands. "When did you decide on the arrangement? When did you, how long had you been watching before you decided it was time?" He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, giving it the honesty it deserved. "I watched you leave his marriage," he said finally. "I watched you pack what you were allowed to take and walk out of a building that had contained 3 years of your life and carry yourself with your spine straight and your face composed, even though I could see from where I was watching, what it was costing you." Pause. And I thought, not yet. She needs to find herself before I walk back in. She needs to know who she is on her own terms before I ask her to consider who she might be alongside me. His voice was quiet and completely certain. So I waited 6 more months. And then I made the call. The night settled around those words. "You built the terms," I said. "The exit clause. The 6-month minimum." "Yes. You built me a door." "I built you a door," he confirmed. "Because I needed you to understand, from the very first document you read, that you were not walking into another arrangement designed to benefit someone else at your expense. That whatever you chose to do with the year, the door would always be there." I looked down at the contract. And if I had used it, the exit clause, if 6 months and I had decided, then I would have honored it, he said. And I would have continued watching from a distance for the rest of my life, which would have been a poor substitute for this, but it would have been the correct price for having loved you impatiently. My throat closed. "You wouldn't have told me?" I asked. "Even then, even if I had left, you would never have." "It had to be your choice," he said. "Everything had to be your choice. That was the only version of this I was willing to take." I looked at him. The full length of him in the night air, the dark suit, the silver at his temples, the careful stillness of a man who had been patient across distances and years that would have broken someone less certain. The face I had been carrying in my memory since I was 7 years old, which was both exactly as I remembered it and nothing like what I remembered it, because memory is always smaller than the thing itself. "Why didn't you come sooner?" My voice was very quiet. "After the divorce. After I left." "Why didn't you?" "Because you needed to know you could stand on your own." He said it gently, directly. "You had spent 3 years inside a marriage that told you, systematically, daily, in every small and large way available to it, that you were insufficient, that you needed managing, that your worth was conditional on your performance of a smallness you were never built for." He looked at me. If I had arrived in the first weeks after your divorce, if I had appeared with resources and history and a love that had been waiting 20 years, you would have wondered for the rest of your life whether you had simply walked from one dependency into another, whether you were capable of choosing yourself. His hand found mine in the dark. I needed you to have the months of knowing you were capable, of knowing that you could rebuild on your own terms, so that when I finally asked you to choose, you would know with complete certainty that you were not choosing me because you needed rescuing. He paused. You were choosing me because you wanted to. I stood in the night air and felt 25 years of love arriving in my body all at once. Not violently, not overwhelmingly, but with the deep settling weight of something true finding its right place at last. Like water finding its level. Like a long-held breath finally released. I thought about the girl I had been at 7. Fearless by necessity, kneeling in a garden, refusing to let something precious leave the world. I thought about the girl at 16 who had laughed instead of saying what she meant because the truth of it was too large and she was too young and afraid for it. I thought about the woman at 29 who had walked into a cold marriage carrying warmth that nobody there had known what to do with. I thought about the woman at 32 with 2 suitcases and a divorce settlement and enough quiet determination to start over. I thought about all the years she had spent not knowing she was being held in someone's attention like something irreplaceable. I looked down at the contract in my hands. 1 year. Clean exit. The most careful gift anyone had ever given me, not the year itself but the door. The door that said, you can leave and I will still be here loving you from a distance because that is what loving you correctly requires. I tore it in half. The sound was small and clean and complete. The 2 pieces separated in my hands and I held them for a moment, feeling the weight of the year I had contracted for, the year that had been a vehicle for something much longer than 12 months, and then I let them go. They drifted slightly in the night air and settled. Severo watched them fall. He was very still. That particular stillness of his, the one I had learned to read, the one that meant something large was being held carefully inside him. What does that mean? He asked. I turned to face him fully. Every curve of me present in the night air. Every year of surviving things that had tried to make me smaller standing alongside me like witnesses. I was wearing the most beautiful thing I had ever owned and standing on a terrace that was now my home, beside the man who had built it into my home 25 years before I arrived, and I had never once in my life felt more completely and accurately like myself. It means I'm not here for a contract, I said. I'm not here for 1 year. I'm not here for the relocation fund or the monthly allowance or the exit clause after 6 months. I stepped toward him. 1 step. Closing the careful distance he had always maintained to give me room. I'm here because 25 years ago a 7-year-old boy held my hand in a garden and looked at me like I was the only real thing in the world. His breath changed. I heard it, the small involuntary shift of someone receiving something they have been waiting for and had not let themselves expect. I'm here because that same boy stood at the edge of his family's property at 16 in a pressed uniform with a bag at his feet and told me he was coming back. My voice held. Completely. And I laughed. I laughed because I was 17 and afraid and the truth of what I felt was too large for me to hold without dropping it. I reached for his left hand. Found the scar with my thumb. The small pale crescent, the one I had put there with my own hands while I was busy keeping him alive. But I kept it, I said quietly. Even when I didn't know I was keeping it. Even when I was inside a marriage that told me daily I was wrong about everything. I kept this. The feeling of this. The knowledge that someone had once looked at me and seen me clearly and said something completely true. His free hand came up slowly and touched my face. His thumb traced along my cheekbone, careful and certain, the touch of a man who had imagined this moment across 25 years and was now allowing himself to be fully inside it. I should have believed you the first time, I said. You believed me when it mattered, he said. His voice was low and entirely undone in the most controlled and beautiful way. You're fearless. You walked through the door. That is the only thing that has ever mattered. I moved the remaining distance between us and his arms came around me. Not urgently, not desperately, but with the deep unhurried certainty of someone finally, after a very long journey, arriving somewhere they had been traveling toward for most of their life. I felt his heart against my cheek and it was steady and strong and real in a way that nothing in the past 3 years had been real. I thought about the girl who had kept herself inviolate through a marriage that had tried in every way available to it to reach her. who had held that private, wordless certainty that what she was protecting was not nothing, that it was for something, for someone, even when she had no name to put to the certainty. She had been right. She had been right the entire time. I was waiting for you, I said. Not as an accusation. Not even as a confession. Simply as a fact. The most accurate description of what the last 25 years had actually been. I didn't know I was waiting. I didn't have the shape of what I was waiting for. But every time Devin, I stopped. Felt him still slightly. Continued. Every time I held that part of myself closed, it was because something in me knew. It wasn't ready to be given to someone who hadn't earned it. I looked up at him. You earned it 25 years ago in a garden. I just didn't know how to say that yet. Something moved through his expression. Large and quiet and entirely his. The expression of a man who has spent 20 years being careful about what his face reveals and is choosing, in this moment on this terrace, to let something through. He lowered his head slowly. Patient even now. Giving me every moment to decide. I closed the last of the distance. And when his lips met mine, it was not like anything I had expected a first kiss to be. Not urgent or overwhelming, or the collision of two people finally reaching each other after too long apart. It was like recognition. Like the last piece of something very large settling into its correct position. Like a sentence that had been building for 25 years finally reaching its period. Warm. Completely, permanently real. Around us the estate breathed in the dark. All its centuries of history finally containing something it had been waiting to hold. The cold stone walls warming slowly. The old grounds resting. The night enormous and clear overhead. I pulled back just enough to look at him. His eyes were open. Looking at me. Seeing me. Fully, clearly, the way they had always seen me. The way they had never stopped seeing me across every year and distance and terrible detour that had stood between this moment and the garden where it had begun. Hi, I said. Something broke across his face. The real smile, the rare one, the one I had been carrying in memory since I was 7 years old, and that was even more devastating in real life than I had remembered. Hi, he said. The estate settled around us. The night held still. And for the first time in 25 years the distance between us was exactly 0. And neither of us was going to do anything to change that. Some women need a billionaire to rescue them. I had needed something rarer and more patient than rescue. I had needed a man who understood that the most profound act of love was not to arrive dramatically but to wait. To build a door instead of a cage. To watch from a careful distance while the woman he loved became completely herself. And to be standing on the other side of the door when she finally, freely, with full knowledge of every alternative, walked through it. He had done all of that. For 25 years. And I had finally stopped laughing long enough to believe him. If this story found something in you, something you've been carrying, something you recognize, leave it in the comments below. Every word. I read them all. And if you want to know what comes next for Alyssa and Severo, what a love this patient looks like when it finally gets to be itself, subscribe. Because this is only the beginning of what they get to be.